Welcome to this episode of Washington in Focus. I'm your host, TJ Martinell. With me is Carlene Johnson. And the story we're going to be discussing is President Donald Trump is taking yet another step towards his promise to dismantle the U.S. Department of Education. And not surprisingly, there's some people who aren't quite happy about that. Carlene, who's not happy with Trump this time?
Yeah, well, here in Washington State, of course, our Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction, under the direction of Chris Rakedal, Superintendent Rakedal is certainly not pleased about it, saying that it's going to harm children, especially those who are, special needs kids with IEPs, individual education programs. That is the sense of it. But this is happening. The question now is going to be how quickly can the Trump ordered dismantling of the U.S. Education Department happen. I mean, he's got 3 years left to make it happen before, another administration would be coming in. But the idea from the Trump administration is that the U.S. Education Department, which came to be many years ago under some guidance of the National Education Association, the nationwide teachers union, they pushed for this, basically saying they kind of wanted this top-down thing where they would have some more control politically, it became, over how states and districts ran their education programs. And there's been a lot of concern that there's just been a ton of bureaucracy, not a lot of control left on the state and local level for education. And so this is how the Trump administration has responded to basically dismantle this. And it's not going to happen overnight, but basically he's dissolving the whole, U.S. Ed department and putting some of the different, priorities of theirs under the administration of other federal agencies, including the Department of the Interior, Department of Labor, that sort of thing.
Okay, so I got to say the irony of Rakedal saying this stuff. I've been covering the state legislature for long enough to remember when Rakedal got elected. And he got elected the same time President Trump got elected. And there was a presentation given during the 2017 legislative session that I attended where they were talking about, I believe it was the Every Student Succeeds Act, which was supposed to replace No Child Left Behind. And one of the emphases of this was that the power and the role of education was going from the federal government back to the states. And they mentioned the 10th Amendment. And Rakedal said, "You had me at 10th Amendment." So he's praising states' rights about 10 years ago when they were, pushing for more state control and state accountability over education. And yet now the president's trying to remove the Department of Education and give basically control back to the states over stuff, and they're not happy about it because I've just noticed that there's been a lot of opposition. It's all depending on whether or not the president's trying to take control over something or whether he's trying to cut funding. So, a lot of people are not big into the federal government when it wants to exert authority over something, but when they want to cut funding, suddenly, the federal government has this role over the states. So I just found that very ironic that the same states that sue Trump every time that he's trying to exercise some sort of power, then they turn around and want to be opposed to him trying to dismantle a federal bureaucracy that's existed only since Carter. So this is a very relatively new department.
It is very, what you bring up is a hugely important point because you've got OSPI under Rakedal, when some sort of federal government agency suits him, and U.S. Department of Education, I suppose, does, that's great. And they want to hang on to that federal oversight. But when it comes to the government and the President Trump administration saying things like, no, you're not going to allow, boys and girls sports anymore. Here's what biological sex really means now. And you can't, and here's the protections under Title IX and Title VI. And at that point, then you have, OSPI here in Washington saying we're not going to comply and we do not believe that we have to. We believe that state control supersedes.
Right. They want government funding with no strings attached. And sorry, but if you're a city and you're trying to get a federal grant for a sidewalk, it has to be compliant with the with federal laws. And this is how the federal government for years has been able to control a lot of stuff that goes on at the local level, because a lot of local governments, including the states, are dependent on federal funding. And with that federal funding comes all these restrictions on what they can do or not do with the money. So this notion that, you have to give us the money and you can't ask any questions about how we're using it, or you can't put any restrictions on it and you can't tell us what to do. Well, I think that that's a form of federalism that would have baffled James Madison and Thomas Jefferson and anybody else who had anything to do with the ratifying of the United States Constitution back in 1789 and all that kind of stuff. So it's just interesting that for people who argue that who criticize the president over the size of government, I would say to them, well, I don't know if he'd have to fight the states to limit the federal government at this point. I mean, if there's going to be a civil war, it's going to be them trying to say you can't reduce the government, the federal government. It's not going to be a fight over states' rights. It's going to be a fight over it's like telling somebody they're not allowed to lose weight, Well,
and what I find to be pretty interesting, and folks maybe aren't familiar with the Freedom Foundation or Washington Policy Center. Of course, those are folks that you and I have worked with for years at the Center Square, because these folks are trying to hold whether it's federal government or local government agencies accountable and to provide transparency. But Freedom Foundation and their CEO, Aaron Withy, I interviewed for this article. And their sense is that this is the best thing that can possibly happen. And their take on the reason why, you've got, Chris Rakedahl and other blue state education leaders resistant to the dismantling of the U.S. Education Department. They believe it's completely because of losing union power. And Freedom Foundation and Washington Policy Center have, through their opt-out programs, post the Janus decision from the U.S. Supreme Court in 2018 that said you don't have to be a union member just to be represented in collective bargaining by your union. There's been, tens of thousands that have opted out and said, wait a minute, I don't so much agree with the politics of my union. And as the article also noted, there have been so many further left and leftist policies from the NEA and the WEA, the Washington Education Association, that a lot of teachers, even if they consider themselves to be Democrats, said, wait a minute, my union dues are going to that?
Well, and I think that
they'll support it.
This goes back to where the concept of consent really changes depending on whether it benefits somebody or not. So it would be like requiring somebody to join a private organization. I'm trying to think of a hypothetical, but the fact that it's saying, oh, as part of your condition for working for the government, you need to be a dues paying member of a private organization, and you're automatically enrolled, and you have to go through this like labyrinth journey to opt yourself out, as opposed to just saying, why not just make, I don't fully understand why we have laws the way we do with unions, where you would just say you can be a member of a union. It's a private organization. They can advocate on your behalf. And anybody who's a member of the union gets the benefits from a collective bargaining agreement, but you can also individually bargain. But you don't, if you're not part of the union, you don't get those benefits or whatever. If there's a pay raise that comes with collective bargaining, great. But then the ability to then opt out of the union very easily means that the union has an incentive to focus on what's best for the current workers, as opposed to saying, we have such a complicated and convoluted process for leaving. Most people aren't going to do it unless they absolutely go, are really opposed. And you can pursue agendas without really having to worry about where your money is going to come from, because you have a more or less guaranteed revenue stream from taxpayers. So I've never fully understood why it is the way it is. I'm sure people come up with different reasons, but it doesn't. In other contexts, we wouldn't tolerate this, right? And the idea you have to either that or say, now if they said, okay, the union can only collectively bargain, but they cannot donate to political campaigns, they can't engage in political activism. I could even then you could maybe make the argument of automatic enrollment or something like that. But this notion that they can then engage in political activism that you don't agree with and they automatically get your money. This is a separate thing from the whole issue of the Department of Education, but it explains why there's opposition to it. To this,
it does, and I think, I think that the other piece of that is people saying, okay, so I want to know where my union dues have been spent. People want to know what the U.S. Education Department has done since its inception. And I am not kidding you when I say you reach out to find out, and there isn't a lot of there. There really isn't. And so,
I mean, that's the question to be begged is what it really goes back to incentives. What incentive has there been for them to improve education? What is the consequences when the education goes downhill? As we know in Washington State, education as the academic performance has gone downhill, even though funding has increased dramatically. And then on top of that, they've just made it so that it's impossible to compare apples to apples with prior years because the metrics are different. And the ways that you determine academic performance are not comparable to, say, 2012. So it makes it difficult to prove it. But at the same time, it's not, if you make it impossible to prove something, you can't say, well, you can't know for certain. Well, that's the problem. If we don't know for certain, that's a government transparency issue on top of how that money is being used. And so you have to really ask, what incentive is there for an entity to improve the performance of the institution that it controls? And if there's no consequences, if nobody's getting fired or removed from the positions, you really have to ask what were the consequences over the last how many years that the Department of Education has existed, where academic performance nationally was not improving. What happened? Who sucked? Oh, go ahead.
Let me paint you one. I know we're getting short on time. Let me paint you one little picture for folks watching this, because I was really made quite an effort to find out, what here in Washington State has the U.S. Department of Education been doing. I know there's probably untold employees and where they're located, different offices around the city, and probably some in Olympia, that sort of a thing. But a story I covered in depth late last year, along with the Washington Parents Network, when they were initially filing the complaints against the U.S. Education Department and the Office of Civil Rights over Title IX violations here in Washington. And that's kind of been sort of set aside, if you will, for now because the Supreme Court is taking up some of these cases. But going into downtown Seattle, and in one of the large buildings just off of, I think it was 4th Avenue in downtown Seattle, up to the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights. A very large office space, very many desks and hallways that you could see through the little window insert through the otherwise, door that was closed. 2 people were in there that day. One came and said, nobody's here to answer your questions. And the other person just sat at a desk behind. I don't know what she was up to. But these are people that have been for years now working from home. And no one is accountable to say how many people are actually on the payroll and what it is they do. Now, I think that is...
What would you say you do here?
Yeah, exactly. So what do you say you do here? Yeah. How many people are saying what they do here and what do they do here? Or from their home, what do they do? And do they ever have to come into the office? So I think kind of some of that, certainly the appearance of government waste, and layers maybe that don't need to be there is what the Trump administration is attempting to reduce with this, dismantling of the U.S. Education Department. I get that there's probably people that work in those roles that believe very strongly in what they're doing and maybe making a real difference in education for our kids. But in that case, those people now need to come forward and go, hey, I'm over here. Don't lose me. Maybe I should be one of the ones who's not, losing their job. I've not heard from any of those people. No one's responding. Nobody's saying, this is the good I'm doing. You're not hearing. It's crickets from the other side. So that tells me one side of the story for now.
Well, we'll have to keep an eye on this and see if the president's going to finally achieve his dream of reducing the size of the government despite efforts to the contrary. So listeners can keep up with this and other stories at thecentersquare.com. I'm your host, TJ Martinell, and thank you for listening to this episode of Washington in Focus.